Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I am joined today by somebody that over the past year has been somewhat of a regular on the show. I've missed his company immensely, but he is back for you today. Charlie, all the way from the UK. Charlie, how you doing?
I'm well, Tom. Yes, great to be back, and I look forward to some of the excellent topics we've got coming up. So lay it on me whenever you're ready. I can't wait.
Good. But before we jump into it, we can definitely tell based on how we're attired and what we're drinking that it's different points of the day. So I saw not the glass of water. I saw the old Coca-Cola mug. I did
Classic, yes.
can't hide it, and I'm armed and dangerous. Um,
Oh, that's it. Different seasons and different times of day.
that
Absolutely. You couldn't hope for a bigger contrast. Absolutely.
That's it. But without any further delay, let's
Mm,
jump into it. So, what we're going to be talking about in this episode is the catechesis process through the eyes of somebody that has gone through it, being
mm,
yourself. So, the people may or may not be aware, but the process of going from being outside the church, the Catholic Church, to becoming a member of that Catholic Church. It's quite rigorous. Uh, it's an elongated process. It's not a matter of just turning up to your local Catholic church and deciding that this is I'm happy here, therefore I'm part of the family. No, there are actual steps that you have to go through, and you have to get taught the teachings of the Catholic Church. So
indeed.
I was thinking you would probably be one of the best people to shed some inlight or shed some light onto what that process is like. So my first question for you is, can you
Mm.
give an overview of the whole process from start to finish? If you can just draw a little bit of a timeline, or a process.
Yes, absolutely. Just by way of introduction, I shall start by saying that I have undergone the catechism program that the Fraternal Society of St. Pius X offers, known as the SSPX, mostly by places. Quite definitely on the traditional side, perhaps a bit rebellious here and there, and they are they are known for several incidents across the various decades have been around. But they offer a fantastic traditional introduction to much of the rather more complex elements of the faith. And they have chosen for the first time to go entirely virtual and see how successful that is. Now, here in the UK, the SSPX, they're very they have to travel a lot. They find themselves in London in one day and Newcastle the next. They offer and say mass with their chapels up and down the land. So a virtual catechism is very useful for them, and they deliver it in such a way that it's very structured. From my catechism thus far, I've had 16 individual lessons over the course of the week, over weekly, I should say. We started with the very simple question of Almighty God. Who is Almighty God? It's very much based on the what is known as the English Penny Catechism, which is a breakdown of all of the questions that you might have about the faith. And we effectively go through the catechism, um, answering these questions in a question and answer type format, and we learn more about the breaking down each question and seeing what each bit means. For instance, I'll give you an example of question 17, which is probably the most important. It's what is God? God is the Supreme Spirit who alone exists of himself and is infinite in all perfections. In effect, in the ordinary catechism course, what you would usually see is that you break down each and every element. Supreme Spirit, you'd learn about the orders of creation. Um, who alone exists of himself. That would be very much Thomas Aquinas's idea of actus purus, that the idea of God is that he is the perfect existence of something. So he is the perfect act of loving, for instance. And in infinite in all perfections, probably the most self-explanatory of the three elements of that question, that he has no effectively his perfection is infinite, which means that he has no imperfections. A perfect example breaking down that question is effectively what we would do in each lesson and learn more and more about the faith based on objectives and going away and listening to various materials I've been assigned. Gosh, it's a very hard one to explain. You might have to put this in a text somewhere. It's Ludwig Ott's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. It's one heck
Okay.
of a book. It's one heck of a book, and it's like our textbook, if you will. So
Hmm.
absolutely, it's a very academic thing, but not so much as you would feel out of your depth at any point, because you're always welcome to ask your priest questions. So
And
hopefully that's given you a brief overview.
And
Absolutely.
on that point, what does
Yeah.
that interaction between the educator and the educated look like? Because while its most basic form, it's that the catechism, the teachings of the Catholic Church formulated into different chapters so that one works through them and by the end can say, I have learnt as many of the teachings of the church and I understand them to the degree necessary for me to become a Catholic. But part and parcel of that education, as I understand it, is also a spiritual director and I've had a mind blank. What would you call yourself? The person wanting to become a Catholic. And so
Oh,
is that an integral part of the process, that interaction between you and your spiritual director?
yes, I couldn't agree more. It has been, yes, it's a very close bond, even over the internet. It's very much the case that we are being taught how to think about the world as well. That it's important to think that being a Catholic is not just a faith, it's a worldview as well. So we've learnt a lot about the philosophy of Aristotle, for instance, because Thomas Aquinas, the doctor of the church, has indeed been, he effectively formalized. I was wondering whether you might notice them.
She can't hide. There she is. The most
Ah,
conspicuous dog that there is in
slinking
the
in.
world, Ellie. God bless her. But back to what you were saying.
Of course, yes,
Yep.
absolutely. So, most likely, if you find the right spiritual instructor for you, bearing in mind that all of them are have a different way of delivering the catechism, which is the most important aspect about it. Um, you will find yourself learning different ways of how to think about it, how to break it down, and ultimately you'll find that you become a different thinker out the other end, if you like. And indeed, I think that comes from the very formal but also intimate bonds that you develop with your instructor, that they are um, instructing you in a faith that will govern the rest of your life,
Mm-hmm.
having come to it at whichever stage in your life, and they ultimately will be laying the groundwork for how much of a traditional or more charismatic Catholic that you are. So absolutely, it's the case that they'll be determining where you fall on the line as well, I suppose. So
Okay.
absolutely, yeah.
And not to put too much pressure on the point, but do you feel like you click really well with your spiritual director? Do they purposefully match you and go, this person would be a great instructor for this person, or a um
Mm.
is it a bit of a factory line and this is the instructor and you're next off the cab rank? How does that work?
Aha.
And just
Well,
in
yes.
your situation, how did it
In,
work?
in my situation, I sought out the instructor that I wish to learn the faith from. So
Mhm.
uh, I took a lot longer about it, I think, than most people might. The easiest way is just to go to your church and say, I am interested in becoming a Catholic, and how do I begin? What kind of journey should I undertake in order? Many call it a journey, and it is a journey. But in my case, yes, I had been going to the church that I'd been going to, the SSPX chapel in Leicester, and they were always brilliant. I always enjoyed the traditional liturgy, and fundamentally, I wanted to know more. So I approached my instructor after Mass. He had said Mass there, and we got talking about catechism. And he said that he had this idea of making a virtual course for people to join in. And we have all the modern technologies. You know, we have a SharePoint for all our lessons, and we uh, we meet in Microsoft Teams every week, and we have a blast of it. And we learn such fundamental elements of the faith in such a way that is so understandable. It's quite incredible how well certain instructors can put it into words. So, in terms of choosing an instructor, I would say find the priest, or even some lay people can even explain the catechism in a way that is very helpful for you. Find a priest who can indeed put the fundamental elements of your faith that you're interested in into words that you can understand. I think is the root of it. Absolutely.
Okay. And you alluded to earlier the fact that are you not the only one part of this virtual online catechesis?
No, 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 indeed,
Wow.
I'm not.
Okay.
Yes.
The
So
the
we are
world we live
being
in.
I know, it's incredible, and
Hmm.
it goes really quite well. I have to say, we started off as a guinea pig group of about three of us, I think, in the end, and now it's grown to something like 10 or 15, which is quite incredible for
Mm.
one session. But it feels no less intimate that the fact that there are 15 of us. That it's a way that the my instructor has a way of speaking in a way that as if they're addressing you directly, which has
Hmm.
been a really, really engaging way of learning the faith. And admittedly, I would like to have been more of an in-depth reader. I've always struggled with in-depth reading, to be honest. So I think when we come to these in-depth sessions second time round, I'm really going to make a go of it, and it's something I'm definitely focusing on. But absolutely, we've had our introductory 16 lessons, and we will be going on to have 16 more undoubtedly. So a proper in-depth course.
Is there much exchange between the students and the teacher in that format, or does the online nature of it make it more one way?
We're always invited to ask questions. It's the case that we are often bowled over by first getting our heads around the contents, and
Right.
then second, wanting to catch every word. I've been guilty of transcribing almost the entire lesson in some cases. But it's absolutely fascinating, truly fascinating. And indeed, I think sometimes you do have to pop in and ask a question. It is possible. You just have to raise your hand in the virtual way as you do now,
Yeah.
and then ask a question, ask away, and you'll receive a most definitely an in-depth answer.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So going back to this process, you
Mm,
take as your starting point the moment when you walked into that church and sought out a spiritual director and
yeah.
said, "I want to become a Catholic." When does that end? So are there various checkpoints that you have to satisfy and checkpoints you have to go through to further that process in
Mm.
addition to digesting the text of and understanding the text of the catechism.
Um, well, it's very much in our case, we have a podcast that we listen to. I know, it's all very modern. It's a digitized version of 16 tapes, and you can find it on the SSPX's website. That this wonderful lady called Daphne McLeod, um, she left a set of 16 tapes, one for each substantive topic of the catechism. For instance, podcast number 4, we call it tape number 4, will be on the Holy Trinity, for instance. Breaking down the elements of the Holy Trinity in a way that is so already very personal. And that's sort of like a reading material for us. It's something that's easily digested. Very much the only preliminary step to becoming a what's the word? I always forget what the word is for undergoing.
A catechumen.
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 There we go.
Wonderful word, wonderful word. Yes, absolutely. So becoming a catechumen is a very much it's a matter of willingness more than preparation. I think it's the willingness to take on an entire worldview.
Hmm.
It's the willingness to learn these aspects of the faith as they are given to you. I say given. It is a way that you can have a dialogue about them in the traditional ancient Greek philosophical way. If you feel confident enough to ask and answer questions about it already, you can make it more Socratic like that, and it's really much about going at a pace which you feel that you can learn each element, not necessarily in depth, but understanding how it fits into a wider picture, I think would be the best way to put it. That's probably, the thing at the root of being a catechumen, but no amount of academic preparation is necessary, I'd say.
It's disposition, and that, I guess, that would make sense given the whole nature of
Yes.
Catholicism and God. Going back to these tapes slash podcasts that you recommended, how do you
Yes.
find those in terms of listening? Because this may be a great opportunity to give them a bit of a plug, because people are always, I always hear people talking and asking about, what's a great resource that I can give to my friend that's making preliminary inquiries into Catholicism. And you really find yourself searching and going all different sorts of places to try and find something that's perfect for somebody, depending on the stage they're at. And how would you
Absolutely.
recommend as a resource the one that you're using? Was it Daphne? What was that?
MacLeod, yes, that's the
Yes.
best way of saying it. Yes,
Uh-huh.
yeah, absolutely. She is absolutely brilliant.
Mhm.
She'll not just take you through the course right from the start, beginning as you absolutely must with who is Almighty God, and finishing. They'll take you all the way through, and the 16th lesson might be of particular interest to those who feel that they are not quite convinced on how the Catholic Church is the real source of truth. They might be finding themselves in between denominations, for instance. Coming to warming to be a Catholic, but not necessarily entirely there. And it's a fantastic lesson, number 16, and it's something to look forward to after you've gone through the entirety of the resources. Very much about how ecumenism should be done between the churches, Christ's churches, and bringing those together under one umbrella, if you will, and the best way to do that in a way that is truly, truly Christian. Fascinating stuff. Absolutely. So I will absolutely send you over a link to these tapes, because they are, of course, available for anyone and everyone to download and listen to.
Please do.
Only half an hour. Yeah, absolutely. I
We
shall.
may even try and post it in the YouTube, just the little footer, so
Oh,
people can access it. So I don't know if I've actually done that before. It's about time we got with the times and started sharing the great information we get access to. We've spent a little bit of time talking about the formal aspect. So
mm,
just want to hit on some things and get your insight into the particular angles. So, for an example, you just mentioned that invariably there are people that find themselves questioning the process while they are themselves going through that process.
yes.
And for you, when you started, how did you feel personally about going through such a structured process that requires really quite a bit of you?
Yes.
It's not enough to say, hey, yeah, rock up one day and say, I want to be a Catholic, and my heart is in this, and so therefore let me in. No, you have to prove it by subjecting and submitting yourself to that catechesis process. So
You do.
how did you feel about that personally?
Personally, I've always been, I thrive best in an element of structure, of course. So when there is a formalistic structure to follow, I find that I can absolutely learn that and then perhaps succeed off the back of that quite easily. For someone who is a bit more of a a freer spirit, perhaps, who enjoys the lessons of the church in a freer way, I wouldn't say that the catechism would prevent you from doing that by any stretch. You could indeed enjoy them in a way that is much more loosely defined, and to go through the questions at your own pace is by no bad thing. Where I remember at regular intervals, at during my first 16 lessons, we were asked whether we were going too quickly through the material. Did we want to speed up with these introductory lessons and perhaps reach the in-depth lessons more quickly? It's a pace at which, we had to agree upon because there were multiple of us. If it's something if you're lucky enough to have one-to-one, I think it's something that you can slow down and speed up at your leisure. I think there is no rush in completing these structural elements that you would perhaps guess by the structure. Is there a pressure to get through it quickly? By no means. I think it's something that has always been intended for some to take years, and for some, I know of someone who came from a Unitarian background of all places, and ended up being a traditional Catholic, and she went through it very, very quickly. Was very happy to pick up on the elements as they go, and fundamentally get through it very quickly. I myself have taken. I would say I had my conversion moment in 2019. I've taken, I suppose, around about 2 years now, but I feel like I'm going through a pace that I'm happy with, and by no means that I don't think any spiritual instructor will pressure you into going any faster than you feel is appropriate by any stretch.
Hmm. And what I find,
Mm.
just remembering back to the days when I went through primary school, I think that was the most structured my own involvement on the receiving end of catechism, that formal process has been. I mean, invariably, as you grow up, you go along to the occasional catechism class, time permitting, and you're continually receiving that catechesis from the pulpit on Sundays, and you're doing your own
Yes.
study as it's the duty of all Catholics to do to further their faith. But in terms of having the actual catechism of the church, that's the beautiful thing about having the opportunity to go to some sort of Catholic educational institution, is
Yes.
that's right there for you. But I would have been in grade 1, 2, or 3, and I remember the pink book. I think it was the Baltimore Catechism something edition, and it was very, very basic and appropriate for my age at the time. You're obviously somewhat older. How do you find the that the product that the church serves up to those making inquiries into it, is it satisfactory? And I think it's you've answered the question evidently by the fact that you're still going through that process. But a non-Catholic who hadn't put themselves through that process would be sitting back and looking on and going, it can't be real. It's all fantastical. It's beautiful myth and legend at the best. So what must those people that submit themselves to a course, an educational course, what that must that be like? Do you find it satisfying as a course?
Um, it fundamentally depends on an open mind, absolutely. But what piece of academia doesn't depend on a on an open mind? I think we live in a world where we're trying to learn things with closed minds, unfortunately. It calls you to abandon your prejudices. It calls you to take a journey, which means starting out things from scratch, if you will. You go in with, if you go in as an adult, you'll have your various ways of thinking about things. Which is why I fundamentally recommend a course that will help you how to think about the course rather than just explaining the elements of it. For instance, I'll go back to that. I believe it's Aristotelian philosophy. I think that's the best way to describe it. That we learn I think you might be familiar with this, Tom, the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the
Hmm.
final cause. A very useful way of breaking it down. Material cause, what's it made of? Formal cause, how did it come to be? Efficient cause, what is its design, and the final cause is, I think what is its purpose, I believe, is the best way to describe that one. Not an expert by any means. Learning a different way of thinking is it is a challenge in and of itself. But it does help you break down those prejudices you might have had prior to entering the course. And I think that's the fundamental step to becoming a Catholic. I think it's to, when Jesus says in the Gospels, leave all things behind and come and walk with me. Effectively, that's what we're being called to do in the catechism. It's the most wonderful thing that hasn't changed for hundreds of years. Yeah, a question here and there might have changed, but we are, as adults, catechumens, being asked to leave behind the world that we came from and then enter into this wonderful new world of truth and wonderful explanations for all the burning questions of your existence that you might have. And absolutely, I think it's going back to it. The fundamental element, I believe, is an open mind. I think it's to think about each teaching that you receive and then think about it in a way that it might impact your life as well.
Hmm.
I
And
think, I
and
think,
and
yes,
another point that could be drawn from what you just said was somebody who wrote extensively on that perspective of and that hierarchy of causes was Aquinas, and that the beautiful thing about the Catholic Church from my mind, and once again, my perspective on this is limited, having been a cradle Catholic and I never well, I mean, I guess over the years, everybody who is a Catholic and has an exploratory mind stops and questions. But I was never on the outside having to make a decision to move in. But
yes,
there is no shortage of brilliant minds in within Catholicism, whether it's
incredible.
Aquinas, Newman, Faber, etc., 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 and the critics that throw the tomatoes from the back rows of the stadium are very rarely willing to confront them genuinely, and their criticisms are normally disingenuous. So I think the content that people would be digesting, it's limitless. Like as you said before, you can take it in at your own pace, because for somebody that is intrigued and wants to know more about that Aristotelian philosophy or Aquinas's writings on it, they're there for you. If that's too much, you don't have to go that far into it. There are plenty of authors that have simplified it and made it digestible. But I would say, and would you agree, that the brilliance of the trueness, put it that way, that the trueness underpinning the Catholic Church makes it very difficult for it not to succeed with somebody who approaches it genuinely and with an open mind.
Yes, absolutely. I think when you get introduced to the Catholic world, my goodness, what a beautiful thing it is. You'll never be alone if you're walking with Aquinas and Augustine. I have to say, truly incredible ways of thinking about the world that fundamentally have fallen by the wayside. Sadly, considering the century that Aquinas wrote in, the 11th century, we call it a dark age. My goodness, if you read the Summa Theologica, you will not think of it as a dark age anymore. Similarly, with Augustine, I believe, if I can get my history right, he was writing at the time of the fall of Constantinople, which felt like an apocalypse for Christians. Then I'm sure, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But
I think if you read the City of God, the whole start of that, I have not read that all the way through, but I think I remember there you go. I started it and I never finished it. A pox upon me. But at the start, he is drawing analogies from, I think it's the barbarian sack of either Rome or Constantinople. One of the two, I can't remember. But I'm so sorry.
Yes.
I interrupted. Charge on.
um, but no, you're quite right that in the sense that now I think I will go into an area that perhaps the Catholic Church is starting to struggle with, sadly. It's inviting people to come and learn with them. I think has been a real struggle, unfortunately. I know that we get the lion's share of our Catholics from, cradle Catholics nowadays, brought up in the faith, and there's absolutely no shame in that. I think you could be a zealous cradle Catholic in the same way that you can be a zealous convert. It just depends on who's doing the instructing, fundamentally. We need instructors who can put the words of God into a message that is clear, and in many cases it's the one that the the most evangelical Protestants use, which is there is an almighty being there that loves you to no ends. You might find comfort in it. You most likely will find comfort in the words of in a world that seems to endlessly hate you for what you are. And you will find that there was this man, Jesus Christ, who has some very good news to give you, and very simple elements like that encourage people to open their minds, because it's very hard to resist a positive message. I find, it's like being angry at someone who's smiling at you. It's struggle, isn't it? Yes.
I have succeeded, but I
Well,
know
that's
I
it.
know I know your point. I know your point.
If it's a genuine smile, I know there's a smugness element to it that might, and perhaps I do struggle from that from time to time. Where if I'm too much of a smug person, sometimes you'll get some very hostile responses. But if you're looking to help someone and you feel to that person genuine, that's where it all begins, I think.
Mhm.
That's how it began with me when I gave my conversion story to you. I was enticed into the ways of Catholicism inside my university cafe. So
Mm.
it always comes from someone who's genuinely willing to go the extra mile to explain something to you, or give you a new way of thinking, or such and such, which is the Christian element of charity. Fundamentally, it ties in beautifully with how we have to preach the gospel. Sophisticated preachers of the gospel always emphasize the correct elements of the gospel. Jesus is undying charity. Jesus is healing of the sick, giving to the poor. All of these elements that we call morally good were always the elements of the gospel that were emphasized, and
Mhm.
they resonated with people. I think there is a deep natural yearning to hear these philosophies and live by them. Unfortunately, sadly, that certain spiritual ways of thinking and deistic ways of thinking have captured the modern mind and soul, but there is by no means no way of breaking them out of that, and it's all in how you preach the gospel, I think, and that's what leads you on to becoming a catechumen, I think.
Mm. I would
Absolutely.
definitely recommend that people dig back through the archives and listen to your conversion story. The interview we did would have been midway through last year, because it is a great story. But the point you just made, in closing, I'd probably like to spend a little bit of time trying to unpack that with you, because to me, that is so important, so interesting, and there are definitely various problems, even though people may not agree on what the problems actually are, and people may not agree on the solutions. But I went through a secular high school and university education system, and so I've been able to set, in terms of having a perspective, meeting atheists, agnostics, Protestants, Catholics, and having people share with me their perspective on the Catholics, and that generally is rightly, or I think in most cases wrongly, people have that negative perception of the openness of Catholics to embrace people into the faith. But I think if we go within, because there's two different elements to it. There's I guess the relationship that Catholicism has with those around it and trying to bring them all into the one true church. But then these days, the crazy version is Catholicism has its own struggles and difficulties within itself when you've got traditional versus what people would call, take by way of example, charismatics, now with a capital C. It's these movements that seem to approach Catholicism in very different ways, and many would argue that some of these ways are not even Catholic. But in terms of the approach to evangelization and sharing that Catholicism, what seems to have happened, I would suggest accidentally, that those associated with the traditional movement, and because they find themselves working 24/7 nonstop, fighting sort of a rearguard preservation fight, and the charismatics and the liberals and the what you'd call on the left side of the aisle, they're the ones approaching with the revolutionary, what I would believe myself to be very dangerous, bordering on Protestant notions of Catholicism, but they're the ones that are going out, throwing the doors open and embracing people. And people traditionally, it's almost become so politicized, and a lot of people have looked on that openness and they see the openness aspect of it as silly and dangerous and charismatic. So I think, I don't want to say, because once again, I'm not a spiritual director or a theologian, but I think there are definitely things that people could learn in terms of that openness and that desire to be apostolic and evangelize without daring to compromise the veracity of the truth. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that point?
Yes. Now, I'd like to harken back to absolutely you say that the Catholic Church today has a lot of flaws about it. You see how we've had to recently contend with how we show to the world how we've solved the diabolical instances of sexual abuse in the church. How have we tackled that as lay Catholics, but how has the clergy done it on their part as well? And if you do some digging, you'll find that they absolutely have. That safeguarding has increased tremendously. And if you go back through history, it appeared to have only occurred, at least as we understand it, in the latter half of the 20th century. But there we are. That's it. It feels like for a lot of people that history begins in the 1960s. That the most wonderful thing about the Catholic Church for me is this centuries old magisterium, is what we call it. The great body of knowledge that the church has become to not just preserve at the beginning of the fall of Rome and throughout, but remember that it was Catholics that saved the vast amounts of wealth of knowledge in Benedictine monasteries at the fall of Rome.
They cultivated the greatest wines,
they did.
everything we enjoy. We owe
goes
a
back
lot to
to
those
Rome.
Catholics.
Indeed. And those are the examples that I think we need to adopt. It's easy to be doom and gloom in this world, that we are entering a second fall of Rome, if you will, that there seems to be no truth anymore. And any organization that claims to profess a truth of a different kind to the one that presently preoccupies the world is hated for that. How can, for instance, a church who abuses its children in that way claim to ever be the truth of the world? It's all very but then again, I always remember what the writer Evelyn Waugh said about the church, that anybody that wasn't divinely ordained would have failed if it were in the Catholic Church's shoes. That it has to have that element of divinity about it to have kept it going for so long, for 2 centuries,
Hmm.
and still be with us today. It's a beautiful quest, I think, to learn more about the church, and you could spend your whole life learning about it. But yes, indeed, but I think it struggles these days with a fortress mentality amongst traditional Catholics. We have
How
to
do you,
love.
on that point, how do you think
Yeah,
one overcomes that? Because I don't
mm,
personally,
it's difficult.
I understand and I believe in agreement with you that it exists, but I have a certain degree of empathy for those that have it, because I understand where
Yes.
it comes from and I understand why it comes, why it is there. So how, how does one take a mentality when one always feels like they're trying to preserve truth and hoard off people who are, hell bent on eradicating that truth, and then flip it into a burning zeal for evangelization? Or is it just a matter of, going back to the rugby playbook and saying, the best form of defense is attack?
Yes. Now, well, indeed. Why is the Vatican built on a hill surrounded by walls? I always hear Protestants sometimes say that. If it's the truth, then why is it not afraid about being the truth? For instance. Gosh, it's difficult to say. I mean, I think it's quite right that we should maintain our own um, fortress, if you will. Just as a good housekeeper keeps their house in order for any guests that might wish to attend. It's the same mentality, really, isn't it? That you look after yourself inwardly,
Mm-hmm.
and that by itself is often enough to entice people into the church. For instance, gosh, well, I when I first started to go to the traditional Latin Mass, I ventured with the ordinary Roman rite, if you will, the a bog standard traditional Latin Mass that was 1962 Missal. Lovely, perfectly reverent, exactly what I'm looking for. It was only on offer every third and fourth Sunday. So as my appetite grew for the traditional mass, I found myself going over to the next parish, over to west of me, and I went to a Dominican rite mass, which was also lovely. 1962 missal again, but had these unique elements about it that had me engaged, and I learned that each individual part of the mass was its own thing that survived over the centuries. That the mass, as we understand it, the traditional one that um, is the consolidated project of the best part of 1500 years. And it's fascinating for that reason alone. And then indeed, I was eventually started going to the SSPX chapel, also in the same parish, and I found that they had such a wonderful community of people there that they felt that like they were participating in the truth, if that makes sense. They were surrounding themselves with truth and then letting it flow out from them. And I think that's what it takes to be a Catholic in the world. That you have to be, we hear it quoted endlessly, often in scorn against us, that we have to be in the world, not of the world. And unfortunately, many of the Christian churches are becoming the world rather than leading the world into a better place. So I think to some degree the fortress mentality is it's an act of self-preservation fundamentally, and it's also a act of preparing oneself for what's to come. Because I don't know, I mean, many of the more traditional Catholics are convinced that there is something very sinister on the way when you speak to them, that charismatics might not identify, perhaps because they they don't have the foreknowledge or the way of interpreting what the signs are or where they are in the world. Or I wouldn't want to disparage them as fellow Christians, but like you said, that they interpret theology and philosophy in a way that it's thrown out the supernatural, if you will. That we have everything within us that we need to obtain salvation. But that's not the case. If you read back through the traditional theology, it's a relationship that we have to develop, certainly, but we are fundamentally flawed, and that's not that's not a popular idea either. That now, you know, especially after the Second Vatican Council, I'm sure we could do it's a whole video on it. I'm not very well versed in it, but from my catechism, we have to understand that how pre-Vatican II theology differs from post-Vatican II. And one of the ideas that they threw out in Vatican II was the idea that there is supernatural, that after Vatican II, it became the case that humans have everything within them. God is within us. There is not even necessarily an idea of original sin. It's not very popular in post-Vatican II philosophy because they have to teach the worldly philosophy that humans are perfect by their birth. So that's why I think fundamentally the church might be struggling, because it's not speaking eloquently enough about how we are flawed as human beings, which is not an unpopular idea if you actually approach people properly with it. And secondly, it's about teaching them uh, how things have been done in the past and how these answers are relevant today. That's two big things the churches don't do at the moment with their catechumens, I think.
Okay. So you approached and chose to be catechized by the Society of St. Pius X. And I
Yes.
am also a loyal devotee of the sacraments and the Catholicism offered by the Society of St. Pius X and their priests. How do you find receiving uh, Catholic instruction from the Society, capital S?
I have found that they are theologically very sound. And not just in the resources that they recommend, it's the way that they deliver it. It's delivered as if they live the Catholic theology. They are taught from their first introduction to the society to their death that they have to be outward emanations of the Catholic truth. Something that you don't really see with priests today in general, that they don't live their faith, which is a real sad thing to see. Every SSPX priest that I've spoken with is inwardly and outwardly composed in a way that they will answer any question that you have about the faith with confidence on the spot, because, well, probably because they're offering mass every day up and down the country, that they live the mass and they live the Catholic elements that surround the mass. They offer a catechism that might be attractive to some who are looking for something that is guaranteed to be taught with enthusiasm, that is guaranteed to be taught with confidence, and perhaps that overcomes some of your prejudices. That when an idea is taught confidently, it gives you that inner confidence to embrace it as the truth. Fundamentally, that's what I found from the society's catechism, and they have been absolutely brilliant. And they make use of some very everyday materials that we can access. I mean, I don't think an 1870s book on Catholic dogma is very is very everyday nowadays, but it's available to be picked up, and it has many of the answers of the in both scripture and tradition, which is a very important part of the Catholic Church. That you have those two elements, that we're not just fighting with scripture. We have the church fathers, and all the way down the centuries, we have this marvelous tradition that popes and cardinals and all the way down to priests have built up, and the saints of course, have built up for us. Resources that we can use to make ourselves better Catholics, and that is always the distinct advantage that Catholics will have over Protestants. I think that we have this most wonderful, not necessarily over the Orthodox, because they equally have an excellent, wonderful tradition that I hope one day will be united again with the Catholic Church. That's a wonderful topic, but it's been 1,000 years yet. But indeed, I think as Catholics we have that advantage of tradition, and it's something that the Church needs to rediscover. And fundamentally, to answer your question, it's something that the SSPX seeks to preserve. The traditional way of instruction and the traditional elements of the faith that make it so strong, I think.
Charlie, this has been a great conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's great to have you back.
Pleasure.
I'm going to let you go have your English breakfast. But before you go, let's
Yes,
just
of course.
recap. So where are you in the process?
Yes, now, just as a recap, I have finished my 16 introductory lessons, following the tapes that you could, give to your viewers. Absolutely, I shall give you the link afterwards. They are brilliant. We've just gone through those. Each of those is a lesson for us. We unpack the elements of that lesson. So it's a nice, we start with the tape, then we go into a lesson, and then we're encouraged to go away and learn about it as well, just in preparation for the next one. Admittedly, with everything else going on, perhaps I have been a bit more lax than I'd like to be, but hopefully in preparation for the in-depth lessons, I'll be ready for that. And that's what we're going on to next. We're going to be learning about these in-depth elements of the faith, really tackling perhaps the dogmatic questions, learning more about that philosophy, that Platonic Aristotelian philosophy that I told you about, learning more about how to think about as a Catholic as well. Think as a Catholic, that's the most important element. And going through the same 16 topics that we learned, because those are the 16 building blocks of the faith, if you like. So very much going through it all again, round two, as they say. And the sale is
Well,
good.
I wish you all the very best, and you will be in our prayers, and hopefully all the viewers that watch this will be cheering you on and praying for you, and you'll be doing that for me and for them in return. Good luck.
Absolutely.
Cheers to you. God bless. It's been a great
you.
chat, and I can't wait to get you back here to
it's been a
hear more
pleasure,
wonderful
Tom.
stuff.
A pleasure. Thank you ever so much for having me on again. It's been brilliant.
Charlie, until next time.
Thank you.